Why do we need diverse characters in games? Hi, I'm Javier Rayon, the startup founder and writer of Dream of Darkness. I believe that in the geopolitical landscape of polarized societies, diverse game characters can spark empathy and a critical view of history at a massive scale. There is a problem: a rise of government leaders that manipulate history to polarize their societies. But historical games can reverse this thanks to millions of players looking for diverse characters. These kind of characters can reflect the real complex struggles of their periods, to reflect that there were no simple good versus bad guys in the historical period of our game or today. We'll explore this trend with the President of Mexico, López Obrador, and how we're solving this issue by designing our characters for our game Dream of Darkness, set in the Spanish Mexica, also called Aztec, First Contact. History and public policy have led me to write our characters that allow the general public to have a better understanding of these crossroads. As mentioned, an example of a populist leader is the President of Mexico, López Obrador. He polarizes people via his party Morena, darker-skinned woman, that's what it means, and Mexican revolutionary nationalism, that tells a simplistic good versus bad historical narrative. He calls on the pueblo bueno, the noble poor people, to oppose the fifis, intellectuals and rich people. Using this justification, he is dismantling the institutional checks of power to our executive branch. Every time bodies like the Electoral College, the judicial system, Congress, or NGOs oppose his measures, he disqualifies them as neoliberals and members of an international power mafia that subdues Mexico. Lopez every weekday holds at least a 1.5-hour press conference, pushing this divisive narrative, denouncing supposed enemies to his movement, from asking the King of Spain to apologize for the colonization of Mexico, as well as inventing false facts daily, including a different year for the foundation of the Mexica capital, to have an excuse and throw a city-wide anniversary in time for the elections. Historians, economists, and more experts correct him on his false daily remarks. Still, as of December 2021, Lopez holds between 58 and 68% approval rate, in part because he links his administration's public image to his distorted nationalistic figures, including the Aztec. More deeply, however, his incentives are appealing to his base because, according to the economist Schettino, they reflect the 300 years of colonial rule that many people still prefer in Mexico, but they are not aware of their historical origin. This is why at Dream of Darkness we're designing narrative arcs that reflect these still present economic incentives as character motivations. Lopez's economic policy is to disincentivize free market competition and instead having the government as the driver of the economy, securing the loyalty of people to his regime in exchange of extractive, exclusive economic rights, as described by the economists Robinson and Acemoglu. To achieve this, he has reversed reforms that allowed private competition in the energy industry, as well as dismantled incentives for renewable energy and startups in general. In a similar way, he has reversed the education reform that demanded public teachers to pass examinations to be allowed to instruct. This has secured him the support of Mexico's teachers' unions, one of the most powerful of the Americas, Mexico's oil workers, and more corporations. Finally, his more popular policy program is direct transfers to young and older age groups. According to the economist Schettino, this model was the standard in Mexico's 20th century of revolutionary nationalism, and is still popular with a large part of the population because it goes back even further to the 300 years when Mexico was a colony of Imperial Spain. According to the economists Robinson and Acemoglu again, this popular and autocratic phenomenon is not the design of today's public servants like López Obrador, but instead the consequence of the extractive institutions and incentives that already existed in many territories, including our Mesoamerica, before European colonization, and that were taken over, in our case, by the Spanish. These economic systems monopolized labor that produced wealth. In contrast with what the general public may believe, and games continued to push, the Spanish were not an effort organized by the crown looking for gold.
I told them that we were Aztecs, representatives of the great Montezuma. Their leader said that his people were Spanish, and he named himself Cortés, although he seemed pleased when we referred to him as Quetzalcoatl. Although their armor and animals seemed otherworldly, they did not seem like gods to me. We presented Cortés gifts of finest cotton and plumes of bird feathers, but he seemed more interested in the gold ornaments. He asked again and again if there was more gold to be found in Tenochtitlan.
Instead, as described by the historian Restel, the Spanish colonists were individual entrepreneurs, risking their lives and investing their personal resources with the main goal of subduing populations. If successful, they could be granted an encomienda from the Spanish crown. The owner of this economic unit could exploit the native people living there in an exclusive manner. If the indigenous people resisted, it was legal to punish and kill them. The owner benefited immensely from the extracted labor in exchange for supposed protection and Christianization. As described by Robinson and Acemoglu, this concentration of riches in a small group tempted disputant groups who, via violence, toppled the rulers of the time to take their place at the top of the exploitative system. Before the Spanish, this had already happened between Mesoamerican groups. Across centuries, this visual cycle has led not to inclusive individual rights, value creation, and market competition, but instead to exploitative, exclusive rights of economic activities in exchange for supporting political rulers. To understand this dynamic, our game allows the players to experience it by taking control of complex characters based on historians' findings. From Dream of Darkness Prologue, available on itch.io, we start with a private Spanish company in a rush to new lands to gain encomiendas, and worried about competitors beating them.
Who knows? We don't know what happened to the island. We just know many sailors reported of its existence. Alright, let's see what this hidden information is. Anton separates the pages with care. A thin letter is within. It has a wax seal from its hometown of Paulus. Uh-oh. Wife! Is this you? What news could come? Ooh. Alright. Ooh, we have a bunch of things here going on. But here the map is the other way around. Look, here's north-north and south is south. Anton, you're reading the map upside down, you fool! Turn the map around! What you doing? Let's see. Anton recognizes the signature of his previous Captain General Hernandez de Cordoba. He tells about his discovery of a settlement of a more Mayatec speakers. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. No wonder Anton needs help with coordinates. I know, right? He doesn't know the way up and down of a map. He's supposed to read it the other way around. If you're talking about consistency. Okay, that form a rich encomienda, but it's more dangerous than other routes. By the concealment and seal, Anton deduces his disgraced patron intended the clue for him, but was too delicate, especially when their entire company collapsed before paying its finances. May you rest in peace, sir. Thank you. Oh, does it look like a taco? What looks like a taco? No sailor can explore this alone. With whom should Anton share the letter? Anton heads back to deck.
From the get-go, our Spanish characters are cornered with no other prospect than surviving and encomiendas. We combine for players the familiarity of a story-driven adventure with the real motivations of the 16th century, with the Spain that was just unified, as described by Professor Restel. But isn't history and public policy too complex for players? According to Newzoo, the leading game intelligence provider, 50% of US and UK players are looking for diverse characters in games. With 4 billion players in the world, almost half of the population according to the game researcher Eva Krujit, this leads us to a potential audience hungry for more than the usual good versus bad narrative. This is why our players will control characters from the Spanish, Mexica, and Tlaxcalteca perspectives, grounded in narrative arcs that convey this public policy and historical findings. So how did the economic exploitation in Mexico begin? Our players will start by playing a few decades before the arrival of the Spanish, when the Tlaxcalteca deeply envied the Mexica, who had amassed the most riches and allies. The Tlaxcalteca fought to topple their sworn enemies and secure the benefits for themselves. Our players will control Xicotencatl, Prince of Tlaxcala, who will lose his brother as a prisoner of war to the Prince of the Mexica, Cuitláhuac. Xicotencatl was a real person, but I added a fictional brother so players can empathize with his intense hatred that the real Tlaxcalteca felt towards the Mexica. Also, Cuitláhuac was real, the prince and ruler of where I live in Iztapalapa. The Tlaxcalteca were never able to defeat the Mexica in the Mesoamerican way of war, focused on capturing prisoners. So according to my correspondence with Professor Restal, the intense envy and hatred that this group felt was why they were willing later on to make a pact with the devil, the Spanish. As you can see in our Xicotencatl's character design, we're not going for the usual idealized buff heroes of the entertainment industry. His rough and barely working obsidian Macuahuitl weapon conveys how desperate and limited the Tlaxcalteca were, as the only group around them still not conquered by the Mexica. Similarly, we composed his musical theme that you can hear to reflect his hatred and skill in battle. We consulted with the Tlaxcalteca Nahua alive today to validate that Xicotencatl resonates with them. To our team's happiness, the Tlaxcalteca Nahua and historian Fabiola Carrillo validated that our Xicotencatl conveys Camaxtli, the Tlaxcalteca god of war that he fought for. To develop empathy, our players as Xicotencatl will attempt multiple times in our plot to avenge his brother versus the Mexica, but fail. Even though he doesn't trust the Spanish, this leaves him no choice but to manipulate this new group to cripple the Mexica via the Toxcatl massacre. Based on the historian Scollieri, our players will experience this historical event from the conflicting different points of view and motivations of the Spanish, the Mexica, and the Tlaxcalteca. Based on the Tlaxcalteca's real Lienzo de Tlaxcala, a 16th century codex that tells their point of view, we're telling how they were conquerors of the Mexica, instead of the colonial narrative that paints the Spanish as the protagonists. We're only modifying this codex to include Xicotencatl and our game's characters and dialogues. By having their prince as a protagonist in the massacre of the Mexica elite, our players can dispel the colonial myth still repeated by the President López Obrador that Mexicans have been victims to imperial Spanish intervention. Instead, players can tell that it was a more complex event, with Tlaxcala, a state of modern Mexico, as conquerors, and with compelling reasons like hate, envy, and the struggle for riches. In a similar way, the Spanish are not, and never were, simple bad guys. This is why we have in Dream of Darkness our Isabel Rodriguez, the real first nurse of the Americas, one of our Spanish characters who was discriminated against just for being a woman. To get across in what precarious situation the Spanish entrepreneurs were, she cannot kill our game's cosmic horror entities based on Mexica mythology that have awoken because of the Toxcatl massacre. Instead, she uses her own instruments as an entrepreneur to heal whoever might help her and piece together why there is such violence and who can she trust. She's at mortal risk from both monsters and even some Spanish who competed amongst themselves. Her leader, Cortés, did not credit her at all in his real letters to the king to claim and as many benefits as possible for himself. I only learned about Isabel by reading Cervantes de Salazar's Chronicle. More deeply, our Isabel reflects the discrimination caused by the recent Spanish conquest of Al-Andalus, the Al-Andalus Caliphate, and were prosecuting anyone who was not Christian. This is why I wrote our Isabel with a Berber mother of the Islamic faith, like many real Spanish of the time, a secret that can get her killed. While the Spanish persecuted deeply anything not Christian, from Islamic to Mesoamerican beliefs, at the same time they had contradictions, like a deep assimilation of these different cultures. This is why our Isabel will use items in Arabic, like the armband of her mother and her astrolabe. This leads our players to experience, when controlling Isabel, that many Spanish were just looking to survive, and not to kill the indigenous allies on whose lives they depended. Isabel will see the aftermath of the Toxcatl massacre, and will be horrified and puzzled, as it was not her objective to kill the Mexica, like many other real Spanish. We're designing a game mechanic based on Scolari's conflicting accounts that will allow Isabel to piece together what happened based on texts, environmental storytelling, and survivors. This way, we won't give to our players the true version. They will have to create their own thanks to a critical view of evidence and history. Now, this is not the first time that entertainment helps historical findings to reach a wider audience, as Professor Miller, director of the Getty Institute, shared with us.
Is history fiction? And every time we sit down to write a book of history, we're selecting things.
Of course.
And putting some things in the foreground and letting other things drop to the background. So history always is so edited. And one could say that the best historical fiction, so the books, for example, of Hilary Mantel have gotten a lot of positive acclaim. She won a major literary prize for 2 of her 3 books on Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell.
Okay.
Who's the exchequer. He's keeping the purse of the king and balancing the budget. And yes, of course, it is all fiction, but it is because we don't know what he really said. But because it is all period appropriate and the historical outcomes are congruent with a series with a backstory, the novels become more important, more effective ways of telling the story than does any kind of history. I'll give you an awful example, an example that you probably hate, and I don't like it either. But when Zorro was popularized as a television series. It was the first time that for many Americans in the United States to understand that Los Angeles was part of Mexico.
It was
So
the very
that-
first time that they realized that. Wow.
Well, it was in the books, it was in the history books, but was
Sure, but
actually rather bad historical fiction that the truth of the story could be told.
I agree
So,
entirely.
I
Yeah.
think there's an important relationship between historical fiction and historical fact.
In conclusion, global geopolitics have populist leaders polarizing their societies by telling their twisted version of history. However, as described by Professors Robinson and Acemoglu, and as players can experience in Dream of Darkness, the extractive accumulation of wealth and power in Mexico predates the arrival of the Spanish, being sparked by the fight between the Tlaxcalteca and the Mexica. Since there are billions of players, and 50% of them in the US and the UK are hungry for diverse characters, Dream of Darkness believes that we can design narrative arcs that convey that there were no good versus bad guys. Instead, there were complex people with conflicting motivations in impossible life or death situations. This can allow the general public to better understand historical findings and solve our social polarization. But wait, who is our Mexica protagonist and what was she trying to achieve? Did you know that in our society, women could be leaders of commerce? Sign up to our newsletter and get our storyboard, script, and historical research, and see how our Mexica leader invites the empire to meet the Maya.